The Nebraska soil tells no lies. 4 generations of calloused hands have worked this earth, coaxing life from dust through drought and plenty. Now, that same earth holds only broken promises. Thunder rolls across a darkening prairie as a man with a bronze star in his pocket and foreclosure notice in his glove box stares at skies that won't yield rain. 93 years of family history reduced to 60 days and a dollar figure. The vultures are circling men in expensive suits who've never seen a seed sprout, who measure a farm's worth in algorithms instead of harvests. But fate has a way of arriving unannounced. When metal tears through storm clouds and fire blooms against the twilight, worlds that should never meet collide in a heartbeat decision. A wounded aircraft, a desperate rescue, and a secret buried in the soil itself, one worth killing for. Some debts can never be repaid. Some land can never be replaced. And some storms bring more than just rain to the parched earth of America's heartland. Thomas Miller stood at the edge of his cornfield, the morning sun casting long shadows across land his family had worked for 4 generations. His weathered hands, spotted with age and marked by decades of labor, trembled slightly as he clutched the foreclosure notice from First Plains Bank. 60 days. After 93 years of Miller's farming this Nebraska soil, the bank was giving him 60 days to come up with $287,000 or lose everything. At 62, Thomas was too young to surrender, but too old to start over. The drought had stretched into its 3rd year, turning what should have been lush cornfields into stunted, yellowing reminders of his failure. He folded the notice carefully and tucked it into the pocket of his faded denim shirt. Beside the Bronze Star medal, he always carried a reminder of another time when survival had seemed impossible. "Talking to the corn won't make it grow, Dad," said a voice behind him. Thomas turned to see his son Michael leaning against the fence post. At 35, Michael had escaped farm life for an accounting job in Omaha, returning only for obligatory weekend visits that grew increasingly tense as the farm situation worsened. "Sometimes the corn listens better than people," Thomas replied, walking toward the old Ford pickup that had belonged to his father. "Frank Wilson wants to meet this afternoon. Says he might have options." Michael snorted. "Frank Wilson hasn't offered a real option to a farmer since 1995. First Plains is just waiting to add our land to their collection." Thomas didn't argue. They both knew the story playing out across Nebraska's farmland. Family operations squeezed by rising costs and falling prices, banks foreclosing, and agricultural conglomerates like AgriGlobal snatching up the land. The Miller farm's 320 acres would be a small addition to their empire, but every acre counted in their quest for total market control. "I'm heading to town for supplies," Thomas said, changing the subject. "Need anything?" "Just a miracle," Michael muttered, turning back toward the house. A miracle. Thomas started the truck, wincing at the familiar pain in his left knee, a souvenir from a landmine outside Da Nang in 1970. He'd survived worse odds in Vietnam. But the enemy then had been visible. Now it was spreadsheets, loan terms, and faceless corporations that were killing his way of life. The First Plains Bank building dominated Clearwater's main street, its modern glass facade jarringly out of place among the century-old brick storefronts. Inside, the air conditioning hit Thomas like a cold slap, reminding him how much he'd sweat through his good shirt on the drive-in. Frank Wilson's office was what Thomas's father would have called city slick, all chrome, glass, and digital displays showing commodities prices that scrolled by like a funeral procession for family farming. "Thomas, good to see you," Frank said, not bothering to stand. At 40-something, Frank had taken over from his father, who had at least known farmers by name rather than by account number. "I've reviewed your situation, and I've got to be straight with you. It's not good. Didn't drive 30 miles for you to tell me what I already know." "Frank?" Frank sighed, tapping his tablet. "Your loan-to-value ratio is upside down. Corn futures are in the tank. And let's be honest, your equipment is practically antique. Most operations your size automated years ago." "Most operations my size are gone," Thomas corrected. bought up by Agri-Global and turned into robot farms. That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Frank slid a glossy folder across the desk. Agri-Global has expressed interest in your property. Given its location adjacent to their other recent acquisitions, they're willing to offer a premium. Thomas left the folder untouched. My grandfather pulled that land through the Dust Bowl with nothing but mules and hope. My father modernized during the Green Revolution while keeping the soil healthy when others were poisoning theirs. And now you want me to hand it over to become another corporate wasteland. Frank's professional smile flickered. Thomas, I understand the emotional attachment, but this is business. The offer would clear your debt with enough left to set you up comfortably. Many of your neighbors have already made the transition. You mean surrendered? I mean adapted. Look, the deadline stands. 60 days. But I'd consider Agri-Global's offer. It's the best option you've got. Thomas finally reached for the folder. Not to read it, but to have something in his hands besides the urge to reach across the desk and grab Frank by his designer tie. I'll think about it. Outside, dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon. The weather report had mentioned possible severe thunderstorms, which normally would have been welcome in drought conditions. But Thomas knew from experience that what his fields needed was gentle, soaking rain, not the violent downpours that would run off the hardened soil and cause more erosion. His truck protested as he turned the key, coughing twice before the engine caught. Another repair he couldn't afford loomed on the horizon. As he pulled onto Main Street, he passed a group of farmers gathered outside the diner, men and women he'd known his entire life, their faces etched with the same worry lines as his own. Many had already lost their farms. Others were hanging on by their fingernails, just like him. Thomas raised his hand in greeting but didn't stop. He couldn't bear another conversation about who was selling out, who was holding on, and who had given up entirely. Jim Crowley had shot himself in his barn last spring when the bank took his family's century farm. Thomas had helped Jim's widow clean out the farmhouse before Agri-Global's property managers arrived. The rain started as Thomas reached the outskirts of town, fat drops hitting his windshield with increasing intensity. By the time he turned onto the county road that would take him home, the storm had intensified into a blinding downpour. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating fields that had once represented the heartland's bounty, but now seemed like monuments to a dying way of life. Thomas slowed the truck to a crawl, peering through the windshield as the wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. The radio crackled with a severe weather warning flash, flooding possible in low-lying areas, wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. He briefly considered pulling over, but knew the road back to the farm included a creek crossing that could flood quickly. Better to press on and get across while he still could. The crack of thunder was so close it made him flinch, followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the sky directly ahead. In that brief, electric moment, Thomas saw something impossible, the distinctive shape of a small aircraft, flying dangerously low, its outline wavering in the storm. What in God's name, he muttered, straining to see through the rain. Another lightning flash confirmed it a plane, no more than a few hundred feet up, clearly struggling against the wind. No pilot with any sense would be flying in these conditions, especially not in what looked like a single-engine craft. As he watched in disbelief, the plane pitched violently to one side, seemed to recover momentarily, then began an unmistakable downward trajectory. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. The aircraft disappeared behind a line of trees, followed seconds later by a dull thud and the distant glow of flames, visible even through the curtain of rain. Without conscious thought, Thomas wrenched the steering wheel to the right, turning onto a muddy access road that ran parallel to the Hayes property. The truck slid in the mud, nearly sending him into the ditch before he regained control. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles showed white, while his mind ran through mental calculations where exactly the plane had gone down, how to reach it through fields that were rapidly turning to quagmires. Whether anyone could have survived such a crash. The access road ended at a cattle gate. Thomas slammed the truck into park and grabbed the emergency kit he kept behind the seat, a habit from his farming days when help was often miles away. His knee screamed in protest as he jumped down into mud that sucked at his boots, but he ignored it, moving with a purpose and focus he hadn't felt in years. The gate yielded to his desperate strength, and he pushed through, running now despite the pain, guided by the orange glow visible through the rain and gathering darkness. The crash site was in Hayes's south pasture, maybe a quarter-mile away. Thomas could smell it now, burning fuel and hot metal, bringing back memories of helicopter crashes in Vietnam that he'd spent decades trying to forget. He splashed through a flooded drainage ditch, the water reaching mid-thigh, almost losing his footing on the slippery bottom. The current tugged at him, surprisingly strong, but he pressed forward, emerging on the other side gasping but determined. The plane had carved a path through a stand of young cottonwoods before coming to rest against a larger tree. The front section was crumpled like an aluminum can, and flames licked up from where the engine compartment should have been. It wasn't a normal civilian aircraft, its lines were too sleek, the materials obviously specialized. Some kind of experimental plane, Thomas guessed, though what it was doing over rural Nebraska in a thunderstorm was beyond comprehension. "Hello," he shouted, approaching the wreckage cautiously. Anyone alive? Only the crackle of flames and the drumming of rain answered him. The heat was intense now, forcing him to shield his face as he circled toward what remained of the cockpit. The canopy was partially shattered, offering a glimpse of a figure inside, slumped over the controls. Thomas knew the aircraft could explode at any moment, but found himself moving closer, driven by the same instinct that had once made him run toward downed helicopters rather than away from them. His knee throbbed in rhythm with his racing pulse as he reached the cockpit and peered inside. The pilot was wearing a specialized flight suit and helmet, both bearing insignia he didn't recognize. Blood trickled from beneath the visor, but as Thomas watched, the figure stirred slightly. Alive. Without further hesitation, Thomas grabbed the emergency release lever on the canopy's exterior, thanking God that some engineer had made it obvious enough for even a civilian to find. The mechanism yielded with a hydraulic hiss, raising what remained of the shattered canopy. The heat was blistering now, singeing the hair on his arms as he reached in to release the pilot's harness. "I've got you," he grunted, pulling the limp form free of the wreckage. "Hold on!" The pilot was lighter than expected, but still a substantial burden for a man Thomas's age with a bad knee. He hoisted the figure over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and began the retreat from the burning aircraft, each step a battle against mud, rain, and exhaustion. They were 20 yards away when the plane exploded, the concussion knocking them both forward into the mud. Thomas instinctively covered the pilot's body with his own as debris rained down around them, his ears ringing from the blast. When he dared to look up, the aircraft was fully engulfed, any evidence of its unusual design now obscured by a fireball that hissed defiantly against the falling rain. Thomas turned his attention to the pilot, carefully removing the helmet to assess injuries. He found himself looking into the face of a woman perhaps in her late 50s, Hispanic features etched with lines of experience, her short salt and pepper hair matted with blood from a nasty gash above her right temple. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing irises so dark they were almost black, before closing again. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Thomas checked her pulse, rapid but strong. "I'm going to get you to safety." No response, but her breathing seemed steady. Thomas retrieved the pilot's helmet, noting its unusual complexity, then lifted her again, adjusting his grip to distribute her weight more evenly. The return journey was even more arduous. The drainage ditch had risen further, and his knee felt like it might give out with each step. But the old determination that had kept him alive in Vietnam, that had sustained him through drought and loss and hardship, propelled him forward. By the time they reached his truck, Thomas was running purely on adrenaline and stubbornness. He laid the pilot carefully in the passenger seat, secured her with the seatbelt, and placed the helmet on the floor. His hands were shaking as he tried his cell phone. No service, as expected in this weather and location. The nearest hospital was in Clearwater, at least 30 minutes away in good conditions. In this storm, on roads that might already be flooding, it could take twice that long. Thomas made a quick decision. His farm was closer 15 minutes if they were lucky. He had a well-stocked first aid kit, and his neighbor, Sarah Johansson, was a retired nurse who lived just 2 miles down the road. If the pilot's condition worsened, he'd get Sarah's help. The truck struggled through the deepening mud, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrent. Thomas stole glances at his passenger, noting with concern that blood was still seeping from her head wound. He reached behind the seat, fumbling for an old but clean bandana, then pressed it carefully against the cut. "Hold on, ma'am," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. "Almost home." The woman stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent before lapsing back into unconsciousness. Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the old truck to its limits despite the treacherous conditions. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his mind. "A miller never leaves someone in trouble. Not in a blizzard, not in a drought, not ever." The creek crossing loomed ahead, illuminated by a flash of lightning that revealed a sight that made Thomas's heart sink. The normally placid stream had become a churning brown torrent that overflowed its banks, covering parts of the road on both sides. But the concrete bridge itself remained above water, barely. Thomas slowed, assessing the situation. Turning back wasn't an option. Going forward meant risking a flash flood sweeping them away. As he hesitated, the injured pilot groaned, her head rolling to one side. The decision made itself. "Hang on," he muttered, shifting into low gear. "This might get rough." He eased the truck onto the bridge, feeling the powerful vibration of rushing water through the steering wheel. Halfway across, a massive tree trunk came hurtling downstream, slamming into the bridge's support with a crack that seemed louder than the thunder. The truck shuddered with the impact, but the old concrete held. Thomas kept his foot steady on the gas, eyes fixed on the far side, until finally they were across and climbing the slight incline to safer ground. The relief was short-lived. As they approached the farm's long driveway, Thomas saw that the lower sections of his cornfields were already flooding, not enough rain to save the crops, but plenty to drown already stressed plants and cause more soil erosion. Another financial hit he couldn't afford, but right now that concern would have to wait. The farmhouse appeared through the rain, a 2-story white clapboard structure built by his grandfather in 1930, expanded by his father in the 60s, and maintained by Thomas through increasingly lean years. The barn stood nearby, its red paint faded but intact, while the collection of outbuildings and equipment sheds spoke to the farm's former prosperity. Thomas pulled up as close to the front porch as possible, killed the engine, and hurried around to the passenger side. The pilot's condition hadn't improved, if anything. Her breathing seemed more labored, and her skin had taken on an alarming pallor. With a strength born of desperation, Thomas lifted her from the truck and carried her toward the house, struggling up the porch steps as lightning illuminated the scene like a strobe light. Inside, he gently laid her on the living room sofa, his mother's handmade quilt still draped across its back from when she'd been alive. The power flickered ominously as Thomas retrieved his extensive first aid kit, a necessity for farmers who often treated their own injuries rather than drive miles to the nearest doctor. He worked methodically, cleaning the head wound, applying butterfly bandages to close it, checking for other injuries. Her right shoulder seemed swollen, possibly dislocated, and bruising was already appearing on her ribs. But her pupils were equal and reactive when he checked with a penlight. A good sign. Thomas was just finishing when the power failed completely, plunging the house into darkness broken only by lightning flashes through the windows. He lit the kerosene lanterns kept ready for such occasions, their warm glow softening the pilot's features as he continued his assessment. Her flight suit was unlike anything he'd seen before, made of some material that seemed to repel the blood and mud, with integrated padding at key points and pockets containing high-tech devices he couldn't identify. There was a name tape above the breast pocket, partially obscured by dirt Vasquez. "Ms. Vasquez." Thomas tried, gently patting her hand. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, followed by alarm as she tried to sit up. "Easy," Thomas said, placing a steadying hand on her uninjured shoulder. "You've been in an accident. Your plane went down." "Plane," she repeated, her voice raspy but clear. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by panic. "The prototype. Did it? It exploded," Thomas said simply. "Nothing left but wreckage now." She closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features that seemed unrelated to her physical injuries. "Anyone else see it go down?" "Just me. As far as I know. Storms kept most folks indoors." Thomas tilted his head, studying her. "You're lucky to be alive. Ms. Vasquez." "Elena," she corrected automatically, then winced as she tried to move her right arm. "And luck had nothing to do with it. I aimed for the softest spot I could find." Her dark eyes assessed him with surprising sharpness for someone who'd just survived a plane crash. "You pulled me out." Thomas nodded. "Vietnam taught me not to leave people in burning wreckage." Understanding flickered across her face. "Marine Army, 1st Cav Division, 1968 to 71. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Air Force, though that was a long time ago." She glanced around the room, taking in the well-worn furniture, family photos on the walls, the agricultural almanac stacked on the coffee table. "This is your farm. What's left of it?" Thomas stood, his knee protesting after the evening's exertions. "You need proper medical attention, but the storms made that impossible for now. Roads are flooding, phones out, and cell service is spotty at best out here, even in good weather." Elena attempted to sit up again, more carefully this time, and Thomas helped position her against the arm of the sofa. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Miller. Thomas Miller. Mr. Miller. But I need to contact my people. They'll be looking for me, and there are complications that need addressing." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Complications like why an experimental aircraft was flying through a severe thunderstorm over rural Nebraska." When she didn't immediately answer, he added, "Or why you seem more concerned about who saw the crash than your own injuries." Elena's expression hardened slightly. "It's complicated. Always is." Thomas moved toward the kitchen. "I was about to make coffee. Storm's not letting up anytime soon, so we might as well be comfortable while you figure out what you're going to tell me." Left alone, Elena Vasquez carefully assessed her situation. The head wound was painful but not debilitating. Her shoulder dislocated. She was certain would need proper treatment. Ribs bruised but probably not broken. The prototype was destroyed, which was both a disaster and, possibly, a blessing. And her rescuer, this Vietnam veteran farmer, was clearly sharper than he let on. When Thomas returned with 2 steaming mugs, she had managed to sit up fully, her left hand instinctively checking for the secure satellite phone that should have been in her flight suit's inner pocket. It wasn't there. Looking for this, Thomas placed a high-tech device on the coffee table beside her coffee. "Fell out while I was treating you. Doesn't look like any phone I've ever seen." Elena reached for it with her good hand. "It's specialized equipment. For specialized pilots," Thomas finished, settling into his recliner with a barely suppressed groan. His knee was on fire after the evening's exertion. "What exactly were you testing out there, Mitty Vasquez? Because that wasn't any normal Cessna or Piper." She cradled the device in her lap, not attempting to use it yet. "You're right, and I owe you my life, so you deserve some truth." She took a careful sip of coffee, organizing her thoughts. "I'm a test pilot, retired Air Force, now private sector. The aircraft was a prototype with certain advanced features. That's all I can really say." Thomas nodded slowly. "And what made you take this advanced prototype into a level 4 thunderstorm over farmland?" Elena's jaw tightened. "That wasn't planned. Weather reports predicted this system days ago." "I'm not talking about the weather." She met his gaze directly. "I was forced down." Thomas set his coffee aside. "Forced by who?" "That's what I need to find out." Elena attempted to reach for the satellite phone with her right arm, winced sharply, then switched to her left. "My shoulder." Dislocated. I think I can try to set it, but it'll hurt like hell. Wouldn't be the first time. She managed a tight smile. I'd appreciate it. Thomas moved to sit beside her on the sofa. This is going to be unpleasant. Just do it quickly. He positioned himself carefully, placed one hand on her shoulder blade, and gripped her arm with the other. On three. 1. He moved suddenly, applying firm, steady pressure in the correct direction. There was a sickening pop as the joint realigned. Elena's face went white, but she didn't cry out, just one sharp intake of breath, followed by a string of Spanish that Thomas guessed weren't pleasantries. After a moment, she exhaled slowly. You said on 3. They always tense up on 3. Thomas returned to his chair. Should feel better soon, though you'll need to keep it immobilized. She experimentally moved her fingers, then carefully rotated her wrist. Thank you. You've done that before. Farm accidents happen. You learn to handle things yourself out here. He watched as she activated the satellite phone, its display casting a blue glow on her face. So who forced you down and why? Elena typed something one-handed, then set the device aside. I've sent my coordinates. A recovery team will be dispatched when weather permits. She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. The company I work for, Heartland Agricultural Innovations, has developed technology that certain competitors find threatening. The prototype I was testing incorporates some of that technology. Agricultural innovations. Thomas's skepticism was evident. That thing that crashed in my neighbor's field didn't look like any farm equipment I've ever seen. Modern agriculture is more than tractors and combines. Mr. Miller, there was a hint of condescension in her tone that made Thomas bristle. Aerial mapping, soil analysis, targeted resource distribution. The future of farming is as much about information technology as it is about turning soil. So I've been told, right before being informed that family farms like mine are obsolete. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on knees. Which company were you running from Agri Global? Elena's slight flinch told him he'd hit the mark. You're familiar with them. They're buying up every foreclosed farm in the county, including mine. If the bank has its way, Thomas's voice hardened. So forgive me if I'm not particularly sympathetic to corporate agricultural warfare landing in my backyard. A flash of genuine surprise crossed Elena's face. Your farm is in foreclosure. 60 days and counting. Thomas gestured vaguely toward the window, where rain continued to lash against the glass. 3 years of drought, falling prices, rising costs. Same story playing out across the Midwest. The family farm is dying. Miss Vasquez and companies like yours and AgriGlobal are writing the obituary. Elena studied him with new interest. How long has your family been here? Since 1930. My grandfather broke this ground during the Dust Bowl. My father expanded it during the boom years. I've spent the last 2 decades watching it shrink back to survival size. A bitter smile twisted his lips. Though apparently even that's too large for a family operation nowadays. The satellite phone chimed, drawing Elena's attention. She read the incoming message, her expression darkening. The recovery team can't make it until morning, minimum. The storm system is too widespread for helicopter extraction. She looked up at Thomas. I hope my presence won't be an imposition. Saving your life was the imposition. Ma'am, letting you sleep on the couch is just hospitality. Thomas stood, his knee finally stiffening up after the adrenaline had worn off. I'll find you something to wear besides that flight suit and make up the guest room. As he limped toward the stairs, Elena called after him. Mr. Miller, thank you. Not everyone would have done what you did tonight. Thomas paused at the foot of the stairs, one hand gripping the banister to take weight off his bad knee. Around here, we still look out for each other. It's about the only thing corporate agriculture hasn't managed to take from us yet. Morning arrived with unexpected brilliance, the storm having cleared overnight to leave behind a wash-clean world of vibrant colors and dripping foliage. Thomas woke at his usual pre-dawn hour, habit overcoming his exhaustion from the previous night's events. His knee had stiffened painfully, requiring the cane he usually refused to use. As he made his way downstairs, he found the living room empty, the quilt neatly folded on the sofa where Elena had initially rested. For a moment, he wondered if she'd somehow been extracted during the night. But then he heard movement from the kitchen, the subtle clink of a spoon against ceramic. Elena Vasquez sat at his kitchen table, dressed in an old flannel shirt of his that hung loosely on her frame, and a pair of jeans that must have belonged to his late wife, judging by how they'd been cinched with a belt. Her injured arm was supported by a makeshift sling fashioned from what looked like a dish towel. Before her on the table lay a neat stack of papers, some of Thomas's farm records that he'd left out. He realized with a twinge of annoyance. "Hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the steaming mug before her. "Coffee maker seems straightforward enough to operate one-handed." "Help yourself," Thomas replied, reaching for his own mug from the cabinet. "Though I see you already have." Elena had the grace to look slightly abashed as she pushed the farm records aside. "Professional curiosity. 40 years of soil composition data is actually quite valuable. You know, not valuable enough to stop the bank from foreclosing, apparently." Thomas poured his coffee and lowered himself carefully into the chair opposite her. "Your people coming soon?" She nodded. "Weather's clear enough for helicopter extraction. They'll be here within the hour." She studied him over the rim of her mug. "Your knee is worse this morning. Old injuries complain when overused. Nothing new." He gestured toward her makeshift sling. "Shoulder. Better than expected, thanks to your field medicine." Elena set down her mug, her expression becoming more serious. "Mr. Miller, before my team arrives, I want to compensate you for your assistance in any inconvenience the crash may have caused." Thomas waved dismissively. "Not necessary." "I insist." She reached into the flight suit, which was draped over the back of another chair, and extracted a slim wallet. "I'm authorized to provide immediate compensation for—" "I said no," Thomas interrupted, an edge creeping into his voice. "I didn't pull you out of that wreckage for a reward." Elena studied him for a moment, then returned the wallet to her flight suit. "As you wish, but my company will still need to document the incident and ensure there are no lingering concerns." "You mean make sure I don't talk about the top-secret aircraft that crashed on my neighbor's property?" Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, Ms. Vasquez. I've kept government secrets for 50 years. One more won't make any difference." A faint expression of surprise crossed her features. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Miller. Funny. I was just thinking the same about you." Thomas took a long sip of his coffee, then set the mug down deliberately. "Corporate test pilot with military background, flying experimental agricultural technology that AgriGlobal wants badly enough to force you down in a storm, and now you're sitting at my kitchen table, reading through farm records that I'm guessing are more interesting to you than you're letting on." Elena's posture shifted subtly, a defensive reaction that confirmed Thomas's suspicions. "As I said, professional curiosity." "Uh-huh." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Let me make an educated guess. Heartland Agricultural Innovations isn't just worried about AgriGlobal stealing your technology. You're worried about them controlling the entire agricultural sector, small farms included." A flicker of genuine emotion crossed Elena's face before she masked it. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're too interested in my farm's data, soil samples spanning decades, crop rotation records, rainfall patterns. This is historical environmental data that big ag companies would kill for. Literal ground truth that their satellites and drones can't replicate." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly does HII want with family farm data, Ms. Vasquez?" The distant thrum of helicopter rotors saved Elena from having to answer immediately. She rose from the table, gathering the flight suit with her good arm. "That would be my extraction team, Mr. Miller." "Save it," Thomas said, not unkindly. "You have your secrets. I respect that. Just remember that whatever game you're playing with AgriGlobal, There are real people caught in the middle. People who've worked this land for generations and are about to lose everything. Elena hesitated, then nodded once, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge more than his words alone. I understand, and thank you again. Not everyone would have done what you did last night. Thomas followed her outside at a slower pace, his cane tapping against the worn floorboards of the porch as a sleek black helicopter bearing no markings settled onto the open area near his barn. The downdraft flattened the already struggling cornstalks at the field's edge, another small indignity in a season full of them. Two men in nondescript black uniforms emerged from the helicopter and approached Elena, their manner professional but deferential. They spoke briefly, one of them casting occasional glances toward Thomas, before escorting her to the waiting aircraft. At the door, Elena turned and raised her good hand in a final gesture of farewell. Thomas returned it, then watched as the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply to the east before disappearing over the horizon. Only after it had gone did Thomas notice something on the porch swing, Elena's satellite phone, deliberately left behind. Beside it was a business card, weighted down with a small stone. He picked it up, examining the embossed lettering, Elena Vasquez, Chief Executive Officer, Heartland Agricultural Innovations, preserving the future by honoring the past. On the back, handwritten in a precise script, we should talk about your farm. 402-355-7842. Thomas pocketed the card, his mind racing with implications. The CEO of HAI had crashed on his neighbor's property, been rescued by him, and now wanted to talk about his farm. It couldn't be coincidence, yet nothing about the previous night's events suggested it had been planned. He was still pondering this when the sound of tires on gravel announced Michael's return. His son emerged from his modest sedan, looking like he'd slept poorly, his city clothes a stark contrast to the farm setting. Was that a helicopter I saw from the highway? Michael asked, climbing the porch steps. Since when do you rate executive transport? Long story, Thomas replied, not ready to share the details. Even with his son. Shouldn't you be heading back to Omaha? Thought you had meetings today? Michael shrugged. Took the day off. Figured after yesterday's bank meeting, you might need some help sorting things out. He gestured toward Thomas's cane, knee acting up again. Just overdid it last night. Nothing serious. Thomas tucked the cane under his arm, a small act of defiance against his own body's limitations. Coffee's on if you want some. Inside, Michael surveyed the kitchen, noticing the two used mugs and Elena's hastily vacated place at the table. You had company at 6 a.m. Like I said, long story. Thomas busied himself rinsing mugs at the sink. How's Diane and the kids? Deflecting as usual, Michael noted, but accepted the change of subject. They're fine. Josh is starting high school this fall, if you can believe it. Megan's looking at colleges. The conversation turned to safer topics, grandchildren, Michael's job, the upcoming county fair that would likely be Thomas's last as a participating farmer rather than a spectator. Neither mentioned the foreclosure notice directly, though it hung between them like an unwelcome guest. After Michael departed, promising to return the following weekend, Thomas found himself alone with his thoughts and the mysterious business card. The practical farmer in him said to ignore it. Corporate interest in his land could only complicate the inevitable. But the Bronze Star recipient, the man who'd run toward a burning aircraft rather than away from it, that man was curious. He pulled out his ancient flip phone, a source of constant teasing from Michael, and dialed the number on the card. It rang only once before being answered. Mr. Miller, Elena's voice came through with perfect clarity. I was hoping you'd call Miss Vasquez, Thomas replied, keeping his tone neutral. Or should I say CEO Vasquez? Elena is fine. There was a pause. I owe you an explanation. You owe me nothing, but I'm listening. Not over the phone. What I have to discuss with you requires more security than this line provides. Another pause. Would you be amenable to a meeting tomorrow? Perhaps, Thomas considered for a moment. The Double R Diner in Clearwater. Noon. I had something more private in mind. The information I'd like to share is sensitive. I'm sure it is, but I prefer neutral territory for first business meetings. Thomas's tone left no room for negotiation, especially with CEOs who crash experimental aircraft near my property and then develop a sudden interest in my failing farm. A soft chuckle came over the line. Fair enough. The Double R Diner. Noon tomorrow. I'll be there. She hesitated, then added, and Mr. Miller, you might want to bring your farm records. The complete set, if possible. Before Thomas could ask why, the line went dead. The Double R Diner had been a Clearwater institution since 1952, its chrome and red vinyl interior largely unchanged in the intervening decades. Thomas arrived early, selecting a booth at the back with a clear view of both the entrance and the emergency exit, old habits from Vietnam that had never quite faded. He'd brought a worn leather binder containing the farm's essential records, though he wasn't sure why Elena Vasquez would have any legitimate interest in them. Perhaps it was simply a corporate fishing expedition, looking for data points to feed into some algorithm. Or maybe HAI was considering his property for purchase, another competitor to Agri Global in the race to consume family farms. The bell above the door jingled, and Thomas glanced up, expecting to see Elena. Instead, he found himself looking at Frank Wilson from the bank, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit that screamed, "Corporate executive?" Thomas sank lower in his booth, hoping to avoid a confrontation. But it was too late. Frank had spotted him. Thomas, just the man we were hoping to see. Frank's professional smile was firmly in place as he approached, the corporate man following in his wake. This is Robert Chambers from Agri Global. He's very interested in discussing your property. Thomas didn't stand or offer his hand. Seems my farm is suddenly popular, but I'm afraid I'm waiting for someone. Gentlemen, Frank's smile dimmed slightly. This won't take long. Mr. Chambers has been authorized to increase Agri Global's initial offer by 15%. Given your situation, I thought you'd want to know immediately. 15% more for land my family has worked for nearly a century. Thomas kept his voice level, though anger simmered beneath the surface. How generous. The corporate man Chambers spoke for the first time, his tone smooth and practiced. Mr. Miller, we understand the emotional attachment to family property, but farming is changing. Operations like yours simply can't compete with modern agricultural methods. Agri Global is offering you a dignified exit and fair compensation. Dignified exit, Thomas repeated, the words tasting bitter. Is that what you call it when you buy foreclosed farms for pennies on the dollar and replace generations of knowledge with drones and algorithms? Chambers' smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. We call it progress, Mr. Miller, the future of agriculture. Your neighbors have understood this reality, the Johanssons, the Petersons, the Hayes family. All have accepted our offers. Thomas felt a chill. Hayes, where Elena's plane had crashed. Had Agri Global already acquired that property? His thoughts were interrupted by the diner's bell jingling again. All three men turned to see who had entered. Elena Vasquez stood in the doorway, surveying the scene with a calculating gaze. Gone was the injured pilot in borrowed clothes. Today she wore a tailored business suit in deep blue, her short salt and pepper hair neatly styled, the cut on her forehead nearly invisible beneath expert makeup. Only the sling supporting her right arm gave any indication of her recent ordeal. Her eyes locked with Thomas's, then shifted to the two men standing beside his booth. Something flickered across her features. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. She approached with confident strides. Mr. Miller, she said, extending her left hand. I hope I'm not interrupting. Thomas stood, accepting her handshake. Not at all. These gentlemen were just leaving. He gestured to the leather binder on the table. I brought those records you were interested in. Frank Wilson looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Thomas, you didn't mention you had a meeting with... I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met. Elena Vasquez, she supplied smoothly. CEO of Heartland Agricultural Innovations. She turned her attention to Chambers, her expression cooling noticeably. And Robert Chambers. It's been a while. The agri-global executive had gone very still, his corporate polish momentarily cracked. Elena, this is unexpected. I imagine it is. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Especially given yesterday's weather event. Thomas watched the exchange with growing interest. There was clearly history between these two, and Elena's reference to the weather event seemed to carry significant weight, judging by Chambers' barely concealed discomfort. Frank, sensing tension but not understanding its source, attempted to regain control of the situation. Ms. Vasquez, if you're interested in the Miller property, I should inform you that AgriGlobal has already made a substantial offer. Has the property been foreclosed upon? Elena asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Well, no, not yet, but then it's not the bank's place to solicit or accept offers. Is it? Elena turned her attention back to Thomas. Mr. Miller and I have a private meeting scheduled. If you'll excuse us. Frank looked like he wanted to object, but Chambers placed a restraining hand on his arm. We'll discuss this another time, Mr. Miller. His gaze shifted to Elena. Always a pleasure, Elena. We should catch up soon. I'm sure we will, she replied, the undercurrent of tension unmistakable. After the two men had departed, Elena slid into the booth opposite Thomas. I apologize for the theatrics. Robert Chambers and I have history. So I gathered. Thomas reopened the leather binder that contained his farm records. You want to tell me what's really going on here, because I'm getting tired of being the only one who doesn't know why my failing farm is suddenly the center of corporate attention. Elena signaled to the waitress for coffee before responding. It's complicated. Mr. Miller, you said that last night. Try again. She studied him for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. Very well. The simple version is that your farm sits on land with unique properties that both HAI and AgriGlobal are very interested in. Thomas frowned. Unique how it's the same soil my neighbors have? Not exactly. Elena accepted a mug of coffee from the waitress, waiting until they were alone again before continuing. Your family's farming practices over the past 90 years have created something extraordinary, a microbiome of exceptional diversity and resilience. Your soil contains bacterial communities that have adapted to drought conditions while maintaining fertility levels that should be impossible given the limited rainfall. Thomas stared at her. How could you possibly know that? The prototype that crashed wasn't just carrying aviation technology. It was equipped with advanced sensing equipment designed to analyze soil composition from the air. Elena took a sip of her coffee. We've been mapping agricultural land across the Midwest for months. Your property shows readings unlike anything we've seen elsewhere. And that's why AgriGlobal wants my land for some bacteria in the soil. Partly, Elena leaned forward slightly. But there's more. Your farm records 90 years of meticulous documentation of planting techniques, crop rotation, fertilizer usage, rainfall patterns. That's a data set that can't be replicated or manufactured. Combined with the soil samples, it could be the key to developing drought-resistant farming methods that don't rely on genetic modification or chemical saturation. Thomas tried to process this information. So both HII and AgriGlobal want my land for research? AgriGlobal wants to exploit it, Elena corrected, her voice hardening. They'll extract what's valuable, patent it, and continue their industrial agriculture model that's destroying family farms across the country. HAI wants to understand it to develop methods that could help small farmers survive in changing climate conditions. Noble goal, Thomas said, skepticism evident in his tone. But you're still a corporation, Miss Vasquez. Profit matters more than preservation. To some, perhaps. Elena set down her mug, her expression sincere. Mr. Miller, I grew up on a family farm in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. My father lost it to drought and debt in 1978. I know exactly what you're facing because I've lived it. The revelation surprised Thomas, though he kept his expression neutral. So this is personal for you. In a way, she gestured to the binder between them. May I? Thomas pushed it toward her, watching as she carefully examined the records his family had maintained for generations. Her good hand traced the neat columns of figures, rainfall measurements, crop yields, soil temperature readings with a reverence that seemed genuine. This is extraordinary, she murmured. Your grandfather was ahead of his time. These composting methods in the 1940s, the windbreak placements, the water conservation techniques during the drought of '56. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Mr. Miller, this isn't just a farm. It's a living laboratory of sustainable agriculture. It's my home, Thomas corrected quietly, and in 60 days, it won't be mine anymore. Elena closed the binder gently. What if it didn't have to be that way? Unless you're offering to pay off my loans out of charity, I don't see alternatives. Not charity, partnership. Elena leaned forward, her voice intense. HODI wants to establish a research station on working farms places where we can study successful adaptation techniques in real-world conditions. Your property would be ideal. We'd provide funding to clear your debt and modernize your operation. In return, we'd establish monitoring stations and continue the documentation your family began. Thomas's eyes narrowed. And who would own the land? You would. That's the point. We're not interested in acquiring property. We want to work with farmers who understand the land intimately. Elena's expression was earnest. Think of it as being paid for knowledge your family has already created. The farm continues operating under your direction, with HAI as a research partner and financial backer. It sounded too good to be true, which in Thomas's experience meant it probably was. And what does HAI get out of this arrangement? Data, exclusive access to the microbiome on your property, first rights to any agricultural innovations developed from our research there. Elena shrugged slightly. And the satisfaction of keeping AgriGlobal from acquiring another family farm. Thomas sat back, considering her words. After decades of struggling alone against market forces and climate change, the idea of a corporate ally was simultaneously appealing and suspect. Why would you crash an experimental aircraft just to make this offer? Elena's expression darkened. I didn't crash intentionally, Mr. Miller. As I told you last night, I was forced down by AgriGlobal. That seems extreme, even for corporate espionage. Not directly, no, but they've contracted with former military pilots who are willing to take risks that conventional corporate security wouldn't. Elena glanced around the diner, then lowered her voice. The timing of their offer to you isn't coincidental. They know we've identified your property as valuable, and they're moving to acquire it before we can establish a relationship. Thomas processed this information, his military training helping him evaluate its plausibility. It seemed far-fetched, yet the tension between Elena and Chambers had been palpable. And the helicopter that had extracted Elena had certainly been equipped for more than standard corporate transport. Let's say I believe you, he said finally. What exactly would this partnership entail? Because I'm not interested in becoming a corporate showpiece some quaint farmer trotted out for photo ops while HAI runs the real operation. Elena smiled, the expression genuine this time. Quite the opposite. Your farming expertise is exactly what we value. The partnership would be structured as follows. HAI provides immediate funding to clear your bank debt and establish a 5-year operating fund. You continue farming using your traditional methods, but with access to HAI technology and support when you want it, we establish monitoring stations on your property and receive regular soil samples. All innovations developed using your land or data would provide royalties to your family in perpetuity. It sounded reasonable, perhaps even generous. Too generous. And if I decide to end the partnership, the debt clearance is a grant, not a loan. You'd keep ownership of your land regardless. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and extracted a slim folder. I've prepared a preliminary proposal for your review. Take your time examining it. Consult with a lawyer at our expense. If you wish. Thomas accepted the folder but didn't open it. Ms. Vasquez Elena, I appreciate the offer, but I've been farming long enough to know that if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. A wise perspective, she acknowledged, which is why I'm not asking for an immediate decision. Review the proposal, ask questions, do your research on HAI. She produced a business card, a different one from what she'd left the previous day, this one with direct contact information. And I'd be happy to arrange a visit to our research facility in Lincoln so you can see our work firsthand. Thomas pocketed the card, his mind already racing with questions and possibilities. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. Elena glanced at her watch. I have another appointment, but before I go, she hesitated, then continued. Mr. Miller, regardless of your decision, AgriGlobal will continue pursuing your property, and they won't be as transparent about their intentions as I've been. Meaning they've been known to accelerate foreclosures through their banking connections, to create difficulties for farmers who won't sell willingly. Her expression was grave. Frank Wilson may seem like a small-town banker, but First Plains was acquired by Mid-Continental Financial last year, and guess who sits on their board? Thomas felt a chill of recognition. Robert Chambers. Elena nodded. AgriGlobal plays a long game. Mr. Miller, they've been positioning themselves to acquire your property for years. The drought just made it easier. She stood, adjusting her sling slightly. I'll be in touch. And thank you again for everything. As Thomas watched her leave, he was struck by the contradiction she represented: corporate power coupled with apparent idealism, technological advancement alongside respect for traditional methods. Could HAI truly be different from the agribusiness giants that had been devouring family farms for decades? Or was this elaborate offer just another path to the same destination, the end of his family's agricultural legacy? The leather binder containing generations of Miller family farming wisdom sat heavily on the table before him. Whatever he decided, Thomas knew one thing with certainty: the next 60 days would determine not just his future, but the legacy of nearly a century of Miller family stewardship of the Nebraska soil. And somewhere above his farm, invisible but ever-present, corporate interests circled like hawks, waiting for his decision or for his time to run out. The sun sets differently over Nebraska soil that has weathered both drought and destiny. Thomas Miller stands at the edge of his cornfield, bronze star in one pocket, partnership papers in the other, living proof that salvation sometimes arrives in wreckage. 4 generations of Miller wisdom now flow through digital sensors and international research stations, while ancient practices preserved by a stubborn farmer's hand reach laboratories around the world. The old barn still stands, weathered red paint now joined by solar arrays that power both tradition and innovation. Elena Vasquez visits less frequently now, her corporate battles keeping her in boardrooms more than fields. But when she returns, they walk the rows together, 2 survivors who found in each other's scars a map to something worth saving. Family farms continue to vanish across the heartland, swallowed by corporations with appetites larger than their understanding. Yet here, where an experimental aircraft once carved fire through storm clouds, something different grows, a testament to the value of knowledge passed through generations, to the power of standing your ground when the sky itself seems to be falling. Perhaps this is what the land has always whispered to those patient enough to listen, that in the space between what we inherit and what we create lies the truest meaning of home.